What happens when the lifeline of an entire nation is quietly severed in the dark? One tiny island in the Persian Gulf just became the most dangerous piece of real estate on Earth, and almost nobody understood what just shifted while the world was sleeping. If this breakdown matters to you, hit subscribe right now and turn on the bell, because the next chapter of this story breaks tonight, and you do not want to be the last to know it. It began before sunrise. No soldiers crossed any border, no tanks rolled across any desert. Yet, in a single night, an entire country's military artery was quietly cut. From the outside, the operation looked almost invisible. Cameras caught the dull glow of distant explosions on the horizon, and a few regional networks carried brief, nervous reports. But the meaning of what happened was far larger than any of the footage suggested. For most people, war still looks the way it has looked for centuries. They imagine soldiers marching in long columns across open fields. They imagine armored vehicles charging through dusty valleys. They imagine bomber wings carpeting city blocks with high explosive ordnance. That picture is now outdated. Today's wars are quieter, more patient, and far more surgical in their design. The weapons used today rarely hit the soldier directly. They hit the road the soldier needs to reach the front. They hit the bridge the supply truck must cross. They hit the rail line the heavy ammunition travels along. They hit the power grid that keeps early warning radar alive. They hit the port crane that loads the next missile onto the next cargo vessel at dawn. That is exactly what happened in the early hours of a Friday morning along Iran's southern coast. Precision strikes collapsed 7 major highway and rail bridges that had stood for decades. A central rail junction was severed in 2 separate places. A regional airfield used by combat aircraft suffered heavy damage to its main runway and its fuel storage farm. A coastal port control tower fell into dust and twisted rebar. To the average viewer, these are just pieces of concrete, steel, and shattered glass. To a military planner, they are the veins and arteries of a nation in wartime. Cut them and the heart keeps beating for a while, but the blood stops reaching the limbs that matter most. This is the heart of something strategists now call a logistic siege. It is not about destroying the enemy's army in one dramatic battle. It is about starving that army of the physical ability to move in the first place. It is about making sure the weapons that look terrifying on television cannot actually reach the launch pad. A missile inside a hardened underground bunker is worthless if the bridge connecting that bunker to the rest of the country is now a smoking crater. A drone sitting in a sealed warehouse is just expensive hardware if the highway that delivers its fuel has been reduced to rubble across 3 different valleys. Before we go deeper into what this means for the next several months, take a moment to drop a comment below with the name of you or our country or city. We track every single location, and your comment helps this analysis reach thousands of new viewers across the world who are watching this conflict unfold from thousands of miles away. The strikes did not fall randomly. They were carefully aimed at the specific transport corridors radiating outward from Bandar Abbas, the supreme logistical anchor of Iran's naval forces and coastal missile batteries. Bandar Abbas sits on the northern edge of the Strait of Hormuz, the world's most sensitive maritime bottleneck, the single stretch of water through which roughly 1/5 of all globally traded petroleum passes every single day. Almost everything Iran's coastal defenses depend on flows through this port. At some stage, naval mines are stored here. Anti-ship cruise missiles are staged here. Fast attack patrol boat engines are serviced here. Specialized aviation fuel for combat aircraft is refined and pumped here. All of it is processed through these docks, then pushed outward along a small number of highways and rail lines to operational bases, scattered across the country's southern coastline. When those roads and rails were severed in one coordinated overnight wave, an invisible wall dropped around the city. Commanders suddenly discovered they were sitting inside a geographic cage of their own design. Trucks loaded with critical supplies could not leave the storage depots on schedule. Replacement parts for combat aircraft could not be moved inland. Even basic fuel convoys ground to a halt because the arteries they had relied on for decades were now broken bridges and cratered junctions. Every hour of delay meant another shipment of weapons that simply could not get to where it needed to be. This is where the deeper meaning of the strike begins to unfold. Military planners generally do not like talking about it publicly, but every serious officer understands one quiet truth about modern warfare. A modern military is only as strong as the road network that feeds it. You can stockpile thousands of precision rockets, millions of rounds of artillery shells, and hundreds of attack drones across a dozen secure warehouses. But if the bridges are down, the rail yards are twisted metal, and the mountain tunnels are sealed by debris, those weapons stop being military assets overnight. They become trapped inventory, watched carefully, inventoried daily, and completely unable to influence the outcome of the war their operators claim is already being won. That is exactly why the targeting of those bridges was so strategic. They were not picked for symbolic value or for dramatic video footage. They were picked because each one carried a specific weight in the daily supply chain. Drop one bridge, and a frontline unit loses access to a particular ammunition depot it depends on. Drop a second bridge, and an entire missile brigade runs out of fresh reloads within a few weeks. Drop 7 of them at once, and the entire southern defensive posture begins to wither under the strain of its own isolation. Within hours of the strikes, regional administrative offices issued emergency advisories that were quickly carried across state media. Every major surface road into and out of Bandar Abbas was declared impassable for heavy transport. Freight convoys were halted indefinitely, power substations serving the southern military. Districts were reported damaged. The National Energy Authority went on national television and directly asked citizens to immediately reduce their personal electricity consumption and prepare for rolling blackouts. When a sitting government openly tells its own population to turn off lights and brace for unstable power, that is a public admission of structural distress. It signals to regional intelligence services that the overnight strike did not just nick a naval base on the coastline, it penetrated the deeper core infrastructure that powers military radar installations, command bunkers, and underground weapons depots requiring constant cooling and ventilation. Without reliable high-voltage electricity, advanced air defense computers cannot process incoming targeting data efficiently. Early warning radar networks suffer critical blind spots at exactly the wrong moment. Underground storage facilities lose the ventilation and cooling required to keep volatile chemical munitions stable. This was never an isolated operation. It was the second. Strike in a coordinated 2-part campaign that had quietly begun 24 hours earlier on the open water, far from any coastline. Out at sea, a comprehensive naval cordon was established around Iran's primary oil export terminals. International shipping companies, maritime insurance brokers, and commercial vessel captains monitoring their radios received a clear, unambiguous broadcast. Any commercial tanker attempting to dock, load, or transport crude oil from those offshore terminals would be treated as an active participant in an active conflict zone and would be stopped if necessary. Most commercial captains understood the gravity of the situation immediately. They adjusted their navigation charts, turned their rudders, and moved their vessels into safe anchorages far away from the declared exclusion zone. But there is always one vessel that tests the boundary. A mid-sized commercial tanker flying a foreign flag ignored the continuous radio warnings over hours of monitoring. It was sailing empty, cruising at a steady pace, and making a direct, deliberate line toward Kharg Island as if no broadcast had ever been issued. Kharg Island is not just another piece of land off the Iranian coast. It is the single most important economic valve in the entire country. Nearly all of the crude oil shipped to foreign buyers is processed, stored, and loaded through this one facility. It is, in practical terms, the nation's financial heart, the place that turns underground reserves into hard currency used to pay soldiers and import critical components. What followed next was a quiet masterclass in calibrated deterrence. Instead of using a heavy anti-ship weapon that would have split the hull, killed the crew, and created a massive environmental disaster in the Gulf, a coalition aircraft launched a lightweight, highly accurate tactical missile. The munition was guided directly into the ship's exhaust stack and propulsion housing. It destroyed the upper engine mechanics and severed the exhaust flow. It rendered the vessel dead in the water, disabled, drifting, and unable to continue on its intended course. Yet it did not breach the underlying oil storage tanks, and it did not take a single human life. If you are still watching this far, you clearly follow the deeper mechanics behind these global shifts. Drop a like right now. It costs you nothing, but it tells the algorithm that unfiltered analysis like this still matters, and it pushes this video in front of thousands of viewers who are still relying on surface headlines for their understanding of what is really happening here. Within minutes, commercial satellite tracking data and open-source maritime transponder logs showed the tanker veering sharply away from its original course and drifting toward the open sea with thick smoke rising from its upper deck. The psychological message of that strike traveled faster than any Navy could. Every shipping conglomerate, every tanker owner, every freelance captain, monitoring the maritime frequencies across the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf received a permanent lesson. There would be no slipping through the darkness. Any attempt to generate export revenue to fund ongoing military operations would be intercepted publicly, surgically, and without warning. By combining a total maritime commercial freeze on the water with the destruction of the logistical transport bridges on land, the campaign accomplished in roughly 2 days what conventional warfare would have taken many months to achieve. It trapped the adversaries' financial revenue streams at sea while trapping their military stockpiles, and subjected to this level of structural pressure simply accepts defeat without attempting a major reaction. The response came swiftly, and it demonstrated exactly how cornered the leadership felt. Launch crews fired a coordinated wave of long-range ballistic missiles across the Gulf, aimed directly at military installations in neighboring countries hosting coalition air forces and naval assets. Sirens echoed across bases in Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, and Qatar. The decision to direct fire toward Qatar was particularly revealing. For months, diplomats in Doha had served as the primary neutral mediators, carrying messages back and forth in a desperate effort to negotiate a ceasefire and prevent a wider regional war. When a government begins launching high explosive warheads toward the very nation trying to broker its peace, that is a sign of profound strategic isolation. It suggests the leadership no longer believes a diplomatic exit exists and has chosen instead to lash out in every direction to impose a cost on the surrounding neighborhood while it still can. But amid that flurry of missile launches, one specific strike crossed an invisible red line that deeply alarmed military observers around the world. A high-speed projectile slipped through regional defenses and hit a large-scale power and water desalination complex on the coastline of Kuwait. To understand why that specific impact is so alarming, you have to look at the daily reality of life in the Gulf region. Countries like Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates exist in super arid desert climates. They have virtually no natural freshwater lakes, no major rivers, and extremely limited underground aquifers. Their entire civilization, including their cities, hospitals, schools, and millions of citizens, depends entirely on massive, energy-intensive coastal desalination plants that pump in salty seawater and purify it into drinkable freshwater for daily survival and basic sanitation. A desalination plant is not a radar installation. It is not a fighter jet hangar. It is not a munitions dump. It is the absolute life support system for the civilian population, day after day. Striking a water purification facility changes the nature of a military conflict from a tactical contest between armed combatants into an existential threat against the survival of ordinary families. When water infrastructure is deliberately targeted, it signals that the unspoken rules of engagement have been thrown out the window. It opens the door to a darker form of asymmetric warfare, where basic human utilities are treated as legitimate military objectives worth striking at range. Despite the intensity of that retaliatory volley, the most astonishing data point emerging from the conflict zone is not what was hit. It is what is now not firing. Independent defense analysts, satellite infrared trackers, and regional defense observatories have documented a sharp, undeniable drop in the daily rate of missile launches from coastal batteries. Early in the conflict, launches occurred in massive, saturated swarms designed to overwhelm human radar operators with sheer volume. Now those numbers have dwindled to a small trickle, averaging barely a dozen sporadic launches per day, rather than the dozens per hour seen earlier. Why has the launch rate fallen off a cliff so suddenly? The answer brings us straight back to the shattered bridges of Hormuz province and the smoke still rising from the disabled tanker floating near Kharg Island. Pause right now and share this video with one person you trust. These days, independent analysis is being drowned out by headlines that only tell you what you are allowed to know. A single share pulls back the curtain for someone who has not yet understood what is really unfolding in this part of the world. A ballistic missile is a massive, complex piece of industrial hardware weighing many tons. It requires specialized transport erector launchers to move it from a hidden storage location to a prepared firing position. It requires delicate fuel canisters that must be loaded under controlled conditions. It requires precision guidance calibrators installed by trained technicians. It requires dozens of trained personnel working under blackout conditions with exact timing. You cannot simply carry a multi-ton ballistic weapon across a dry riverbed on the back of a civilian pickup truck when the primary bridge decks have collapsed and the railway junctions have been cratered. The highway corridors that connect the central desert manufacturing plants to the coastal launch sites were severed one by one. The missile batteries, stationed along the coast, are now firing the last remaining rockets in their localized bunkers. The replenishment pipelines from the interior of the country are broken, and there is no immediate way to repair them under fire. The logistics siege is working exactly as the planners envisioned. The enemy is slowly running out of the basic transport routes required to keep its offensive firepower alive, and there is no quick substitute waiting in the wings. At the same time, the effectiveness of layered integrated air and missile defense systems has fundamentally altered the strategic balance across the entire Middle East. During a high-profile NATO summit in early July, the American president shared a striking account with international reporters that sent shockwaves through the global defense community. He described a concentrated high-intensity attack in which an estimated 111 ballistic and cruise missiles were fired in a compressed one-hour window aimed directly at the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln and the surrounding strike group. According to the official account, not a single one of those incoming threats touched the flight deck or breached the outer defensive perimeter. Every threat was tracked, targeted, and neutralized in the sky before it could close the distance. A carrier strike group does not sail alone across open water. It operates as a floating, heavily armored fortress, surrounded by guided missile cruisers and Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, all linked together by advanced Aegis combat systems that share targeting data in real time. These warships project an invisible dome of radar coverage extending for hundreds of miles in every direction. When an incoming missile breaks the horizon somewhere far out at sea, the shipboard computers instantly calculate its trajectory using data fed in from multiple sources. Before the human eye can register the threat, surface-to-air interceptors are already leaving their vertical launch canisters, while high-energy electronic jamming systems flood the missile's onboard guidance sensors with deliberate interference. And when a naval force proves it can absorb a saturation attack of more than 100 missiles without taking a single hit to a major asset, the psychology of the entire conflict shifts overnight. In traditional military doctrine, the fear of losing an aircraft carrier to a surprise strike is the ultimate deterrent that keeps a superpower from escalating too close to an enemy's coastline. If the defensive shield operates with near-perfect reliability under maximum pressure, that deterrent becomes far less intimidating in practice. Command structures in distant capitals gain the confidence to push closer and maintain an aggressive forward presence without the paralyzing fear of catastrophic loss at sea. That newfound confidence is now visible in the sheer scale of the ongoing military buildup across the region. Today, the United States has systematically deployed more than 50,000 armed personnel throughout strategic installations across the Middle East. Under normal peacetime conditions, regional staffing hovers around 40,000 troops. This deployment represents a rapid and substantial increase of 10,000 specialized combat, aviation, logistics, and intelligence soldiers. These forces are not consolidated in one vulnerable superbase. They are strategically distributed across an expansive network of hardened bases in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait. To support this expanded footprint, naval planners have moved heavy amphibious assault platforms into the theater, including the USS Tripoli and her escorts. An amphibious assault ship is essentially a live aircraft carrier packed with thousands of battle-hardened Marines, assault helicopters ready for rapid lift, and squadrons of fifth-generation F-35 stealth fighters designed for high-end contested airspace. Military historians are already noting that this accumulation of naval air power, amphibious armor, and expeditionary ground troops represents the most substantial American force posture seen in the Gulf region since the opening stages of the Iraq War more than 2 decades ago. Senior commanders routinely describe these personnel as operating under a high alert defensive posture, ready to defend regional allies and safeguard maritime commerce. But in the world of real geopolitics, a forward force of 50,000 troops, backed by multiple carrier strike groups and stealth fighters, is never purely defensive in spirit. It is a loaded spring. It is a multi-domain strike force capable of shifting from defensive patrols to sustained high-intensity offensive operations within minutes if the order is given. You do not spend billions of dollars transporting heavy armor and naval armadas halfway around the planet just to make a symbolic statement and quietly pack up for home a few weeks later when the cameras move on. This level of physical commitment, sustained for weeks on end, strongly suggests military planners are preparing for a long, protracted strategic campaign rather than a short shock. They are building a permanent pressure cooker designed to keep the adversary trapped in a state of logistical and economic paralysis for as long as it takes to force a fundamental change in behavior. So what is the ultimate strategic objective of the ruling command in Tehran? Why continue a confrontation that has shattered domestic infrastructure, paralyzed the national economy, and isolated the country from global commerce? Analysts who study the region's long-term doctrine believe the answer lies in what is often called the toll booth strategy. For decades, the deepest strategic ambition of the coastal military apparatus has not been to invade its neighbors or to win a conventional naval battle in open water. The goal has been to establish permanent, undisputed psychological control over the Strait of Hormuz, where roughly 20% of globally traded petroleum moves every single day. Every major economy on Earth depends on the uninterrupted flow of oil and liquefied natural gas through that narrow passage. A government that holds effective veto power over that waterway holds a quiet hand on the global economy's throat. You do not need to physically sink 100 tankers to shut down the strait, in practical terms. You only need to create enough perceived risk that global insurance underwriters, the firms who quietly decide whether commercial shipping is financially viable at all, declare the channel uninsurable for routine cargo. If maritime insurance rates skyrocket overnight or coverage is pulled altogether, commercial shipping companies will voluntarily halt their fleets rather than absorb catastrophic risk. Within 72 hours, global crude oil prices would spike to astronomical highs, stock markets would seize, and foreign governments would face immense domestic political pressure to offer concessions just to restore calm. This strategic concept explains why commercial cargo vessels and oil tankers had been subjected to sporadic, calculated harassment operations long before the current escalation. Those actions were not random acts of piracy by independent crews. They were a deliberate, systematic test of the international community's boundaries and insurance thresholds. The leadership was probing the perimeter, measuring how long it would take for Western naval forces to respond, and how loudly global markets would react. However, the response delivered over the past week has turned the toll booth strategy on its head. Instead of hesitation or diplomatic retreat, the coalition responded with devastating structural sabotage and full maritime control. By dropping the bridges in Hormozgan province, neutralizing coastal radar arrays with electronic warfare, and precision striking the very tankers that tested the cordon, the coalition demonstrated that it is willing to absorb regional friction and systematically dismantle the very infrastructure required to stage maritime disruptions in the first place. The adversary now finds itself trapped in a profound, strategic dilemma with no clean way out. Its daily missile launch capacity has been reduced to a fraction of its earlier peak. Its naval headquarters in Bandar Abbas is geographically isolated from the rest of the country's industrial base. Its primary source, OF sovereign revenue from Kharg Island, is now effectively caged by an unblinking naval blockade. And its most potent asymmetric weapon in the air domain, the mass attack drone, is being systematically blunted by high-tech interceptors and modern algorithms learned from another war zone. Yet despite these devastating operational setbacks, it would be a profound mistake to assume that this conflict is heading toward a swift and tidy conclusion. Strategic ambitions built over 40 years of ideological conditioning and institutional investment do not simply evaporate because a handful of highway overpasses were demolished in one overnight wave. The core determination to project power across the Gulf and retain leverage over global energy corridors remains deeply embedded in the thinking of the men who still make the final decisions. When conventional military options evaporate and domestic logistics fail, a cornered command rarely surrenders outright. It pivots to alternative methods. We are likely entering a phase where direct ballistic missile salvos are slowly replaced by clandestine sabotage, cyber warfare, and quiet, deniable operations that take place below the threshold of headline attention. The battlefield is shifting away from clear aerial engagements toward a shadowy, unpredictable contest of slow attrition that the public may not even notice until something larger breaks. On the other side of the equation, the United States and its regional allies have locked themselves into a posture that leaves very little room for easy de-escalation without losing the strategic gains already paid for in blood and treasure. Maintaining 50,000 high-alert troops and carrier strike groups across the Middle East is itself an immense logistical and financial undertaking that cannot be sustained forever without political cost at home. It signals a long-term containment policy designed to enforce the maritime blockade, maintain constant surveillance over coastal launch zones, and quietly pressure the adversary into accepting a new normal that strips away many of its previous coercive tools. What does this historical turning point tell us about the future of global warfare more broadly? It tells us that the very definition of a military target has permanently changed in ways most people have not yet fully absorbed. The destruction of bridges around Bandar Abbas, the disabling of tankers near Kharg Island, and the targeting of Kuwait's desalination infrastructure together prove that modern conflicts are no longer fought solely between uniformed armies on isolated battlefields far from civilian life. The connective tissue of modern society itself, including the highways that carry food to cities, the power lines that illuminate hospitals, the maritime lanes that transport energy across oceans, and the desalination plants that produce fresh water for entire coastal populations, has become the primary battlefield of the 21st century. When a military strategy evolves to target the very systems that allow a nation to function, feed itself, cool its hospitals, and provide clean water to its children, the resulting scars take generations to heal in the minds of ordinary people. You can rebuild a shattered aircraft hangar in a few months with enough money and engineering, restoring trust in the vital civilian infrastructure that sustains, and it is one that no government can quietly sweep under the rug. Before we close this out, hit the bell one more time and make sure you never miss a single update from this channel. The next escalation cycle will unfold faster than most people expect, and staying subscribed is the only relying on secondhand headlines shaped by editorial interests. History rarely announces its most defining turns with a formal declaration of war, a signed treaty on a world stage, or a dramatic televised address captured on every major network. Instead, it shifts quietly in the dark during early morning hours, when precision munitions drop concrete spans into empty riverbeds and tactical missiles disable commercial ships in silent waters far from any camera. We are living through the moment when the old rules of Middle Eastern engagement were permanently rewritten in ways that will influence global security for decades to come. And the true consequences of the silent logistical siege are only just beginning to surface, not just for the nations directly involved, but for every country that depends on stable energy markets, open sea lanes, and the simple everyday expectation that the next glass of clean water will be there when they turn on the tap at sunrise.